Today we're going to be talking about eugenics. You guys should have done the reading for today, so you should at least have a vague understanding of a number of the people that we're going to be talking about and what eugenics is. As you can see from this particular illustration, it says eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. Basically, this is trying to demonstrate that, as you can see, the roots of eugenics are in things like statistics, anthropology, history, geology, ethnology. I mean, you can see all of the sciences down at the bottom. And then once you put all of those sciences together, eugenics then can flower into a wonderful tree, a healthy tree of humanity. So that's the point that we're going for here. A lot of people do associate eugenics with the Nazis. I think you might have heard me mention that in class. But eugenics actually started a very long time before Hitler decided to sort of begin his final solution, and with a completely different purpose in mind. So it wasn't the mass extermination of the unfit, but it actually was simply the advancement of society through judicious marriage, and we're going to talk about what that means today. It really all began with Darwin, with his On the Origin of the Species that we talked about on Tuesday. So hopefully you remember some of that, and we'll be talking a little bit about some of that. Francis Galton initially developed the ideas of eugenics, and he was Darwin's cousin. He graduated from the University of Cambridge, but not after a mental breakdown. He was in the mathematics department. He was a math major. And before he took his exams, he had a mental breakdown. And he had to take a year off, actually, before he could go back and attempt to pass his exams. So, yeah, I mean, you have this guy here who's attempting to decide who's fit and unfit, and he had definitely a year where he was very unfit. So what he did was, because he was part of this upper class, his father sent him on a grand tour of Africa, which is what a lot of young European men did in this period. He basically sailed up and down the Nile on a boat and relaxed for a while. But while he was there, he was studying the humans who lived in the area, so he did some anthropology, but he also studied the weather patterns, he studied some geology and geography, and wrote up quite a few things and theories based on his work in Africa. One of the things that he decided was that all people are not created equal, and that, there are certain people who are fit to reproduce and who aren't. Chances are he was having unprotected sex with a lot of the natives, so he probably caught an STD or two, because he was probably sleeping mainly with native prostitutes more than sort of just native villagers. He ended up getting married to a woman, and they didn't have any kids. There are questions of whether or not he was able to consummate their marriage, basically because he had problems with his, performance because of all of his, STDs that he picked up while in Africa. But because he was Darwin's cousin, he did pick up On the Origin of Species basically right when it came out. They were, Darwin and Galton were very often correspondents with one another. So Galton read On the Origin basically in 1859 when it came out. From these ideas, he decided that if nature naturally selects for ideal traits, then he can artificially select for human reproduction. He also used the examples that Darwin talked about of artificially selecting fox breeders and dog breeders and horse breeders and farmers who select for certain traits in cows and things like that. Galton said, well, hey, if they can do that, then why can't we select traits in humans that we think are ideal and then promote those as being positive traits that everybody should have? So that was basically where he came up with this idea of eugenics. He wrote 2 important eugenic books, Hereditary Genius in 1869 and Inquiries into Human Faculty in 1883, and a number of others that we're not really going to get into. But Hereditary Genius, he essentially went through in attempts to prove that genius and intelligence is hereditary. He looked at families who had a number of members in the Royal Society as members of the Royal Society, and then went through their family trees to demonstrate that, yep, if you have one person who's really intelligent back in your ancestry, then you're probably going to have more people who are men of science and are actually producing in society. So, I mean, you kind of have this double bind here where, you know, if you have one intelligent person who can do a whole lot of things in society, then chances are the rest of the family may follow along. But at the same time, you do have the outliers. You do have, you know, people from industrial families who do go on to scientific careers. People like Humphrey Davy and other guys like that, whose families aren't necessarily in this hereditary genius type of family. And then Inquiries into Human Faculty, where he actually goes and he does studies on people of their abilities and why certain people have certain abilities, like being really good at mental math or having a really good memory and things like that. One of the ideas that really brings him to wanting to practice this eugenics, he stated in his 1869 Hereditary Genius, he says, "I have no patience with the hypothesis occasionally expressed and often implied, especially in tales written to teach children to be good, that babies are born pretty much alike, and that the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man are steady application and moral effort. It is in the most unqualified manner that I object to pretensions of natural equality." So he's kind of anti-enlightenment here, right? So he wouldn't have subscribed to this idea that, hey, everybody is born a blank slate, everybody has the same potential to achieve greatness in society or in science, mainly because of his studies with genius and intelligence in families. He decided that, it's definitely hereditary, and there's no way that two substandard people can produce somebody of above average intelligence or above average ability to do anything, basically. So Galton, is going against this Enlightenment ideal of, blank slate, but also really against these Victorian ideals that, even the working class still have this ability to rise up and to move up in society, which was a huge thing in Victorian society, especially with the industrialists and people working in factories and things like that. So he goes on in 1883 to define what eugenics is. If you've noticed, I haven't actually defined it yet. I said something about judicious marriage, but he really does put it well into words here. He says that eugenics means good in stock, hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. This and the allied words eugenia, etc., are equally applicable to men, brutes, and plants. We greatly want a brief word to express the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of man, take cognizance of all influences that tend in however remote a degree to give to the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. The word eugenics sufficiently expresses the idea. So he begins talking about the power of nature over this idea of nurture, right? In the past, in the previous slide, he talks about how nurture is not actually working in order to make people better. You can't make people better than their birth state, essentially. And so, because you can't make people better than their birth state, we want to begin practicing this science of improving stock. But also, and he never really argues for this in print, but other people do, basically in the name of eugenics, that society should actually take away from people who don't have very much in order to give more to people with more talent. So if you or your family, sort of get bad grades or have bad jobs, in his, terms of what bad is. So if you're working in a factory and you can hardly support, your family and children, then you should be taxed more heavily as a punishment. And those taxes then should go as payments of merit to people who, are doctors, lawyers, professors, bankers, so that they can be rewarded for being intelligent and doing good things in society. So if you're kind of in the low rungs of society, you should be punished monetarily as well as physically, emotionally, mentally, in the government, politically, all of these things. And if you are, a doctor, lawyer, banker, things like that, who actually participate in society, you're doing good things, you're pillars of society, you should be rewarded. Monetarily mainly, but also with certain political rights and things that other people won't get. So there are ways he wants to go about doing this, and we'll talk more practically here in a few minutes about what that would mean for him. But he also just talks about that, it might kind of sound crazy that we're going to try and do this judicious marriage thing and try and make these decisions of ideal traits. But he argues, as it's easy to obtain by careful selection a permanent breed of dogs or horses gifted with particular powers of running or of doing anything else, so it would be quite practicable to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. So rather than wait and see if people are going to make, eugenically pleasing choices in marriage, we might as well make those decisions for them, because dogs aren't going to do it, and horses, aren't necessarily going to do it. We have to make those choices for them, and we can't wait for this natural selection process to make sure that the strongest survive. We have to make sure that we sort of force it. But there were people against a lot of these ideas at the time, as, you might imagine. So, we talked a little bit on Tuesday about Thomas Henry Huxley, who's also known as Darwin's bulldog. And yes, he's related to Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. Brave New World was a book written in the 1930s. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. Basically, it's about a society based on eugenical choices, and you have the alphas, betas, the gammas, and the deltas. The alphas clearly are the ones who are the most fit. They're the ones who are allowed to procreate, and pretty much everybody else is not. They are sort of work dogs for the alphas. The Huxleys were a huge sort of scientific family. Julian Huxley was also a biologist, and we're going to talk more about him here in a few days. But Thomas Huxley, who really fought for Darwin, as we talked about on Tuesday, with his ideas of evolution, actually wrote a letter to Galton, and he said, "I sometimes wonder whether people who talk so freely about extirpating the unfit ever dispassionately consider their own history. Surely one must be very fit indeed, not to know of an occasion, or perhaps two, in one's life when it would have been only too easy to qualify for a place among the unfit." And this is not to say that he was, trying to dig at Galton for having a mental breakdown at Cambridge, because Huxley might not have even known about that. But, you can kind of see where he's going with this, because Galton surely would not have been considered a fit reproducer during that, year to year and a half period of his life. Even though he came back and passed his mathematical exams and did graduate from Cambridge and did go on to write all of these books, he still, he has that piece in his history where he would have qualified for a place among the unfit, according to what Galton thought was unfit. And extirpating basically just means getting rid of, or stopping them from procreating, which in essence would be getting rid of them. So there were a number of critics Huxley worked with the working class, and so he did believe that people could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if you know that phrase, sort of help themselves in order to have a better life. Another guy who was one of Darwin's proponents, his name is Charles Kingsley, and he wrote a book called The Water Babies. It's basically a moral tale on, boys and girls need to behave so that they can, be better people and make society better. So you do have a number of people who are on Darwin's side who say, this whole, trying to force people into marriage, you have to start thinking about this idea of fit versus unfit, and you can't just kick people out of, the fit category for subjective reasons. So there are a number of people who are detracting from one particular guy who just loved this idea, worked with Francis Galton. His name was Carl Pearson. He's there on the right side of your screen. He worked at University College London, which we've talked about a number of times in the past. It was an institution that began in the early 19th century, and the main goal of UCL was actually to allow the working class and the lower classes to get an education. So it's interesting that you have the eugenics lab here at UCL. Carl Pearson worked pretty closely with Galton until Galton's death in 1911. Together they established the Eugenic Education Society, which actually the goal of the Eugenic Education Society was to educate people on how to make good marriage choices, how to find a woman that you should marry, what are the traits that she should have in order to make really good children. Something that you might know him for, you might know Pearson for if you've never heard of him as a person in and of himself, is the Pearson R coefficient in statistics. Basically, it's the coefficient for quantifying non-continuous data, such as eye color, hair color, skin color, things like that. Data that really is difficult to quantify. And basically, this coefficient itself came about through doing anthropometrics in the eugenics lab. So they would measure people. Not only would they measure sort of their certain, their facial angles and how far apart their eyes were, how big their nose was, how far it stuck out from their face, how wide their face was, how long their face is, and all of this kind of stuff. They would measure basically everything on the body to attempt to come up with the perfect measurements for a perfect person. Also, they attempted to do the opposite, where they said, okay, if a person, if their cheekbones are too close together, or their eyes are too far apart, or this or that or the other, then they have a criminalistic tendency. So they went and they began to measure certain characteristics in a person to see what kind of characteristics showed up in people who were unfit to procreate and people who were more fit to procreate. So not just subjective things like how smart are you and what have you accomplished, but also how far apart are your eyes and what color are your eyes, in context of how far they are apart. Where are your ears? How far do they stick out from your head and things like that. So the coefficient, the Pearson R coefficient, came about because of his work in eugenics. He actually wanted to be remembered for his work in eugenics, but a lot of people actually just remember him for the Pearson R, and they don't know much more about him other than that. So Pearson, in his work in the anthropometric lab, really did want to set up what's called eugenic farms. And basically these were places where people could live, in sort of village compounds, men and women, for national eugenic practices. So really, what he wanted to happen was that, you would examine people, you would take their anthropometrics, you would take their measurements, and then you would decide if they were fit or unfit to reproduce. They were then given, he wanted people then to be given a eugenic license, so kind of like a driver's license or a permit, to say, hey, I'm allowed to procreate with somebody else with this same license. And in order to make that easier, he wanted to set up farms, village compounds, where people could come and procreate. They could come and, make babies, and then they could go out and make the rest of society better. One of his main arguments, Pearson's arguments, was that only 12% of the population reproduces 50% of the next generation. And, how scary is it that a lot of that 12% is the wrong type of person, essentially. And so he wanted to make sure that the right type of people were procreating. He also started a journal called Biometrica, which was a journal for the eugenics lab, and essentially it published articles based on the measurements of particular people, or certain statistical methods and things like that were best for measuring human characteristics and things like that. So it was essentially to spread the ideals of the Eugenic Education Society, and he had graduate students and other people working on articles for this particular journal. But he also depended on people like, hopefully you remember Flinders Petrie, who was an Egyptologist. Petrie actually would excavate cemeteries in Egypt and then send hundreds of skulls and skeletons to Pearson at UCL, because if you recall, Petrie was based at UCL also. And he would send these skulls and skeletons to Pearson for measurements, basically to get a whole load of data in order to, begin figuring out who are the best people, what are the best measurements to procreate. So they need to gather a bunch of data. Not only do they depend on, things like, eugenics fairs and stuff like that we're about to be talking about, but, also archaeological evidence, material evidence, people in the past, and things like that. So what you can see here is an image of, it's basically part of a eugenics fair that UCL put on a number of times, not just, once a year, but more often than that. Pearson, basically, after Galton died in 1911, he had left a pretty big endowment to set up a chair of eugenics at UCL, the Galton Chair of Eugenics. Now, I think it's called the Galton Chair of Biology or Statistics or something like that at University College. So Pearson took this chair. He actually moved from the Applied Mathematics department over to be the first chair of eugenics at UCL in 1911. And he actually had the eugenics lab at UCL flourishing. They were performing national eugenics, so they would invite people in to the lab to measure them, to take their biometrics, so that they could get data. So on top of the, ancient skeletons and things that Petrie is sending in, they're getting actual real live data of people who come into their lab. One of the main problems was that it was basically the same run of people who were coming through. So they were Anglo-Saxon, they were middle to lower middle class. It was a very homogeneous set of people who were coming through, and Pearson wanted a more heterogeneous sample, because if you get a larger sample size, as we know in applied mathematics, the larger the sample size that you get, the more accurate your data are going to be. And like I said before, Pearson really was pushing to have eugenics farms, certificates, so that people knew who, was going to be able to reproduce and, who wouldn't be able to reproduce. Here, though, is where I need to make sure that we understand the difference between positive eugenics and negative eugenics. So positive eugenics basically is a practice of eugenics where the very fit people are encouraged to reproduce with other very fit people. This is not to say that unfit people are not allowed to reproduce, or that unfit people are going to be murdered or killed or sterilized. It's just to say that unfit people who were going to reproduce should be watched, was the idea in positive eugenics, is that the government should watch unfit people to make sure that they're not reproducing without permission, essentially. If they had too many children, then they would be punished monetarily. Taxes and things like that. They would have to pay fines and stuff like that, because society was just going to get worse, was the fear. So again, you have positive eugenics where the fit people are encouraged to reproduce, and the unfit people are discouraged from reproducing in a number of ways. But they're never forcibly sterilized. In negative eugenics, which is the thing that we're most used to hearing about, especially as concerns, say, Hitler and the Nazis, negative eugenics is where, yes, the fit people are encouraged to reproduce, but the big difference here is that the unfit people are not just punished financially, they're actually punished physically. So they can be forcibly sterilized many times without their knowledge, or they're just simply exterminated. In the UK, in Britain, where Galton and Pearson were based, where the beginning, where eugenics had its beginnings, in the UK, they were positive eugenicists. They were encouraging the fit to reproduce while proposing, punishments for the unfit. Now, the big difference is, here in the United States, negative eugenics was practiced, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Another thing I need to make clear is that none of these ideas that Galton and Pearson had were ever put into practice in the UK. They were never put into practice. While Galton and Pearson were taking these measurements, they were writing up data, they were doing all of these experiments in their eugenics lab, and they had a lot of really, good ideas for society, for making society better. None of these were ever put into public policy, none of these were ever made into law, and there was never a single eugenic farm built. So I want you to understand that while these ideas were there, while Galton and Pearson were saying, hey, we really need to do these things, and actually Flinders Petrie wrote a couple of books about eugenics and its usefulness as well, none of these ideas were ever made into law. So don't go thinking that there are all these eugenics farms all over Britain that nobody ever told you about, because it's just not true. So they wished to practice positive eugenics. They were promoting it, but it never actually got put into play for Galton and Pearson. Now, in the U.S., this guy, Charles Davenport, was so inspired by Galton and Pearson and what they were doing. And actually in, I think, 1909, before Galton died, Davenport heard him give a talk. Davenport went to visit in Britain and went to one of Galton's talks. He came back to the United States and really, really wanted to put these practices into play. As you can see from the pamphlet on the left of your screen, the Cold Spring Harbor in New York, Charles Davenport was the director of the Eugenic Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor. Cold Spring Harbor is a biological research station, basically, on Long Island in New York. It still exists. The Eugenics Record Office, however, technically does not. Actually, if you go to their website, which I encourage you to do after this lecture is over, you can try to search for eugenics on their timeline, in their history, their official history on the website. They don't talk about it, but I think you can search, and it's a few layers down, but they have some information there. But basically, as you can see from the left, it says eugenics seeks to improve the natural, physical, mental, and temperamental qualities of the human family. At the very bottom, it says this office is devoted to the study of the biological forces which determine the natural capacities and limitations of mankind. It looks forward to having ultimately a good, working pedigree index of the natural traits of a large portion of the families in America. Their idea was, hey, if we can go around and we can start taking data, much like what Galton and Pearson were doing, because Davenport essentially had the same goals as Galton and Pearson, if we can get a lot of these pedigrees, these traits written down and recorded, then we can start making decisions on who should reproduce and who shouldn't, who is fit and who's not. one of the final sentences down at the bottom, it says, every marriage is an experiment in heredity. And the Eugenic Record Office wished to stop those experiments and actually turn them into value-producing, mating situations. Now, like I said, in the UK, none of their policies were ever put into real action by the government. In the United States, on the other hand, Charles Davenport had a couple of pretty big supporters here in his movement. As you can see, you have the Carnegie Institution of Washington Department of Genetics there written on that pamphlet. The Carnegie Institution was a huge patron of Davenport and the Eugenic Record Office, so Davenport had tons of money at his disposal. Also, the Rockefeller family, who you may or may not, sort of recognize that name as a huge patron of the sciences, but they definitely were. Basically, just was throwing money at Davenport to do these experiments and to get these pedigrees up and running. So, while in the UK the positive eugenics were never put into play, the negative eugenics here in the United States definitely were in practice, really from the 19-teens up into the 1970s. So we're going to talk about that. Davenport wrote a number of books and pamphlets. One of his basic ideas here, he says, man is an organism, an animal, and the laws of improvement of corn and racehorses hold true for him also. Unless people accept this simple truth and let it influence marriage selection, human progress will cease. So he makes a number of the same arguments that Galton makes, right? Because Davenport was completely inspired by Galton's ideas. And he says, hey, if Darwin says that improving corn and racehorses will work if we choose the correct traits, then it also holds true for man as well. Man is an animal and has traits that can be selected for as well. And to go along with these ideas, in order to back up his goals of directing many of these particular judicious marriages, right? He talks about the Commonwealth is greater than any individual in it. Hence the rights of society over life, the reproduction, the behavior, and the traits of the individuals that compose it are, in all matters that concern the life and proper progress of society, limitless. And society may take life, may sterilize, may segregate so as to prevent marriage, may restrict liberty in 100 ways. So he's basically saying here, right, the needs of the many are greater than the needs of the few, and we need to make sure that just because, a few thousand people might be complaining because we've sterilized them or we're not allowing them to get married to who they want to get married to, well, big deal. Because in the end, it's making society better that's important than, if a couple of people are happy or not. And so he actually begins to push for particular laws to be put in place that are put in place pretty quickly. And he and his assistant Harry Laughlin have a lot of sway in Congress. Theodore Roosevelt was a big eugenicist. So I think he was president, in the 20s? I might be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure it was the 20s. But he, was a huge supporter of eugenics and began to support what Davenport was doing here at Cold Spring. At Cold Spring Harbor, what they were attempting to do, like we said before, is to get these pedigrees on people and to figure out what these traits are that are good or not good for breeding, right? Up at the top you can see it says eugenics is the science of the improvement of the human race by better breeding. Among its most important fields of investigation is the study of the inheritance of valuable traits. In order to determine the hereditary potentialities of an individual, the several members of his or her family network must be described both as to good qualities and defects, with care, accuracy, and frankness. So The idea was essentially Cold Spring Harbor hired a bunch of people, graduate students. Women were involved in this. Assistants, biologists, doctors, who would take blank pedigrees that you can see down at the bottom. There's an example, right, of showing some of the symbols. And we'll talk about those in a second. But basically, they would take these blank pedigrees and they would go around. The idea was to cover the whole country and to interview most of the families in America to see about their heredity and to see where, to see what these traits are and how certain families stacked up. And so therefore, they could then begin gathering this data to, see who was fit and unfit. As you can see, the data at Cold Spring Harbor that they're gathering is very different from the data that Galton and Pearson were attempting to gather. So Pearson and Galton were, measuring noses and faces and arms and shoulders in order to put, these personality traits with particular physical traits. But basically what they were doing at Cold Spring Harbor was just measuring these personality traits. So you can see some of these symbols here. We've got up here in the top middle, symbols for normal and valuable traits and qualities. And then over on the right, symbols for defects. Very musical under these valuable traits and qualities. Athletic, noted for energy, remarkable memory, inventor of note, natural ventriloquial power, which I've been trying to figure out what that means, but I don't know what it means. Maybe they're loud speakers. I have no idea what ventriloquial power means. I didn't know that being a ventriloquist was something that was of merit. Sculptor of merit, artist, natural leader of men. All of these things are valuable and normal traits. These are things that people want in their heredity. Symbols for defects over on the right. Epileptic. Feeble-minded. What does feeble-minded even mean? I mean, think about that. These are such vague traits many times that really, again, like we said, anybody could be deemed unfit at any point in their life for being feeble-minded. Insane, neurotic, criminalistic, alcoholic, sex offender, wanderer, right? Somebody who just likes to travel a lot or can't set down roots. Chorea, I'm not, and again, I've looked this up and I'm not actually sure exactly what it is. It's unclear. General paralysis, cancer, tuberculosis, and we're going to talk about this in a few weeks, where tuberculosis was seen as an illness not that you catch because it's a microorganism, or an illness that can be passed through casual contact, but it was seen as an illness that you get by being weak, by being sinful. So having tuberculosis was a defectual trait. And then, of course, traits unknown. So something's wrong with them, but we're not really sure what, so you just put an X there. And then down at the bottom, you can see this pedigree showing the use of symbols. You have your natural leader, alcoholic, remarkable memory. So you have all of these different people within one particular pedigree. And it's just shown as an example of what certain pedigrees may or may not look like. And again, they're trying to get, let's say they interview here in the third generation listed. So, your you might be down here, you might be the grandchild, and, your parents are up here, and then your grandparents, and then your great-grandparents, and your great-great-grandparents. So they tried to get as many generations as they possibly could of, these pedigrees, which were extremely important for gathering all of this data. Some more graphics here to demonstrate what some of these anthropometric fairs looked like in the United States. While they had them in the UK, what we have here are images of the ones from the United States. As you can see here, it says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Down on the bottom row here, you have two light bulbs. The one on the left, it says, this light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, a person is born in the United States. And then on the right-hand side, it says every 7 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States. They'll have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. And it's meant to be a visual reminder that, make good choices when you decide to procreate. And if you're not one of these, high-grade people, then don't be a burden on the rest of society. And just watch out, basically, with who you're marrying. Here we have another image, and what they would do with the Eugenics Record Office is they would, basically, this is a line of men who were standing in line during the 20s and the early 30s. They had lost their jobs. They're looking for, they're standing in line for, to sign up for basically government benefits. And as you can see, and a lot of these men are recent immigrants to the United States, so they can't even really speak English. So they're basically given these signs to hold, and then they get pictures taken of them, and then the signs get taken back. So, I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? I cannot read this sign. By what right have I children? Right, because if he can't read the sign, then his kids and grandkids are not going to be able to read the sign either. One of the reasons why he couldn't read the sign is because he couldn't speak English. He couldn't read English, but chances are, he could speak and read whatever his native language was, but that wasn't what was taken into account when you came into the United States many times. Harry Laughlin, as I mentioned before, was the assistant to Charles Davenport at the Eugenics Record Office. He was the head of the Eugenics Record Office from 1910. Arguably, he was the single most influential figure in the United States eugenics movement. He was the big proponent behind these pedigrees, of which, thousands and thousands of these pedigrees were taken. They still have them in their archives at the Eugenics Record Office. So these records were taken. He was also the eugenic advisor to the United States House of Representatives. He helped to come up with immigration laws and sterilization laws that covered most of the United States. So his basic idea was, don't let feeble-minded people immigrate into the United States. How do you decide who's feeble-minded? Well, you have immigrants who are coming in on Ellis Island. You have them take IQ tests. Well, most of these people coming in on Ellis Island are not native English speakers. So the language that the IQ test was given in? English. Many of these people failed, and they were either turned away or they were given notice, of certain things that they were not allowed to do once they entered the United States and things like this. So they were immediately marked as unfit as they came into the United States. So in his seeking to limit the immigration of these people, a number of people were turned away based on his ideas of what fit and unfit were, as well as advocating for sterilization. So if you let these people in, you have to monitor their procreation. If they already have kids, okay, fine. But if they decide to have more children, we really have to nip that in the bud, and we're going to begin sort of sterilizing people without their permission, and many times without them even knowing. So that becomes a problem. In 1926, he published a book called The Eugenical Sterilization in America, and he was, obviously, hopefully as has come across, he was extremely influential in the American movement for negative eugenics. And he talks about the future eugenical code will cover such features as human migration, marriage and mate selection, eugenical sterilization, birth control, eugenical education, and many other factors in the regulation of quality and quantity of population. So clearly, he, Davenport, Galton, Pearson, Petrie, all of these guys, Roosevelt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, they all believed that they were clearly eugenically fit to reproduce. And on top of that, not only were they fit to reproduce eugenically, but they were also fit to make decisions about who else got to reproduce. So they began setting up these eugenical codes in the United States that would become law for the next 50 years in many cases. And like Davenport said, individual rights don't really necessarily matter. Individual liberties, whether or not individuals are happy, that doesn't matter. He says, as in the case of commitment to an institution, so that is people that are found feeble-minded, or, just unfit to reproduce. We can commit them to an institution, individuals. If he does not consent, he may be seized and treated for his own benefit and for the protection of society. So, treated means he'll be sterilized without his consent. Mainly because it's better for him not to have to worry about taking care of a child that is going to be feeble-minded too. It's going to be a burden not only on him, but on the rest of society. Think about the money we could save if we didn't have to populate the prisons with the children of these people. As of January 1st, 1937, you can see the extent of sterilization laws across the United States. 16 states by 1937 had not yet passed sterilization laws, Missouri included in that. And I'm fairly sure that Missouri never passed a sterilization law. 3 states had sterilization laws but did not have any by January 1st, 1937. You could see up in New York and in New Jersey they had sterilization laws, but by January 1st, 1937 had gotten rid of them. New York had sterilized, it looks like 206 people, but then, got rid of their sterilization laws. So we have 29 states with sterilization laws, with the number of officially reported operations in each. So California sterilized over 11,000 people. Most of these were without the consent of the people who were sterilized. And most of the people who were sterilized were women. So what they would do is they would put them in an institution, or if these people were already institutionalized, say in a mental institution or in some sort of alcoholic rehab center or something like that, and they would say, "Oh, you have appendicitis. We need to take your appendix out." And then instead they would go in and cut their fallopian tubes. So there would be no way for the egg to get from the ovary to the uterus to be fertilized. So in that way they would have no way of having children. But they would also not know that they were sterilized. So this happened to thousands of people all over the United States. Very recently, I think in either Alabama or Georgia, there was a woman in the 70s or 80s who realized that she was sterile because of these forced sterilizations back throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She had been told that, again, she had appendicitis or some other abdominal issue she was put under, and when she came out without her knowing, she was sterile. And she and her husband tried to have children for years and years and years, and then she finally found out that she was one of the people who had been sterilized without her consent and without her knowledge, and she's suing the state for that and the federal government. So there are still issues coming about, even presently, of these people who had been sterilized and not allowed to procreate based on what, a few men believed were certain traits. So as you can see, right, even though in the UK there were no laws even promoting positive eugenics, here in the United States, sterilization laws were spread all over the country. One of the arguments here, right, we have an example of, a pre-Revolutionary War woman named Ada Duke. 1740. Here it says her sterilization would have cost $150. 92% of her descendants are problems. They are burdens on the state. 64 of them are mentally diseased, 174 sex perverts, 196 illegitimates, 142 paupers, 77 criminals and murderers. And shall we allow the Ada Dukes of today to continue this multiplication of misery? When those who will pay for the pound of cure When will those who pay for the pound of the cure demand the ounce of prevention instead? So basically they're saying, look, we pay for these people to be in prison. We pay for their food and their shelter and their safety. And it costs a lot of money to do that. So instead, why don't we just save a bunch of money and sterilize them to begin with? And that way, as a society, we can put that money towards the good people, right? The eugenically fit people, and rewarding them with education and with jobs and with benefits, and take away from the people who are social problems. So as you can see, these ideas were widespread throughout the United States. It wasn't just near Cold Spring Harbor. It went from Cold Spring Harbor all the way to California, Oregon, Washington. It affected, our immigration laws. It affected a number of things here in the United States. Recently, as 1927, there was a Supreme Court case. It's a fairly famous case decided by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the presiding head of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The basic idea was this. Carrie Buck, there in the top right-hand corner of your screen, she's sitting at the left of that picture. And the idea was this. She was in an institution, and they wished to, or actually they did sterilize her without her consent, and she wanted to sue. And so the story went like this. Carrie Buck's mother, who is Addie Emmett, and her father, Carrie Buck, was an illegitimate child of Addie and Frank Buck. So therefore, Carrie Buck's mother was deemed feeble-minded. Carrie Buck herself was given up for adoption, and in her foster home, she was beaten and raped by her foster father, and became pregnant with her daughter, Vivian Alice Elaine Buck. So she had an illegitimate child, but it wasn't even her fault that she had an illegitimate child. But these dotted lines here show illegitimate mating, which demonstrates if you have illegitimate children in 1927, you're not married, but you still get pregnant, that demonstrates that you are feeble-minded, that you're not making good decisions. So Carrie Buck's daughter, in 1924, when she was born, tests at the time when she was 18 months old, when Vivian Buck was 18 months old, showed that she was backward. I don't know how at 18 months old you can demonstrate backwardness, but apparently she did. So Carrie Buck ended up suing, basically in Virginia, for the forced sterilization. She said, look, this isn't fair that you're forcibly sterilizing me, mainly because I didn't really have a choice in this whole matter. And the doctor here is Bell. He's arguing that, yes, in fact, I am allowed to sterilize her based on the laws of the state. The decision, in the end, was given by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he said he relied actually on an earlier case. He relied on precedents, Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1904, which upheld a Massachusetts law requiring school children to be vaccinated against smallpox. So basically he says, we are vaccinating school children against smallpox, this disease that can kill you. And in essence, if we are sterilizing women and men who are feeble-minded, then it's as if we're vaccinating society against feeble-mindedness. Part of his decision here is, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." And he goes on to, reference the Bucks, Carrie Buck's mother, Carrie Buck herself, and then her daughter. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So he upholds the sterilization of Carrie Buck and says it's constitutional because we require children to be vaccinated against smallpox. It is okay to forcibly sterilize women and men, but mainly women, so that they cannot reproduce feeble-minded children. So that we can have a more fit society. And this was in 1927. And of course, we are going to close, as you sort of have to, almost any presentation on eugenics, with talking about Hitler. There are arguments that Hitler read Darwin and immediately thought, I can do this to the Jews. But that's not necessarily the case. There are also arguments that he read Darwin, and he also read Francis Galton, and he read Charles Davenport, and in that way decided, I can make my society more fit by getting rid of the unfit, which is exactly what he did. Obviously, for a number of reasons, Hitler took it to a degree that nobody had any idea about. Some people, I think, Gillum, that you read for today, talks about how, it's okay, Galton didn't mean to, start the Holocaust. And people apologize for Galton's ideas. But really, historically, Galton died in 1911. He had no idea that anything like, Hitler's final solution would come about because of his, eugenical thoughts. So the Minnesota Eugenics Society, that was incorporated in 1926, sent a telegram to Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who actually became Chancellor, I think, it was in 1933. They say, Honorable Chancellor, I enclose a clipping from the Minneapolis Journal of Minnesota, United States of America, relating to and praising your plan to stamp out mental inferiority among the German people. It was known in the early 1930s sort of what Hitler was beginning to do. You can't go around and, start, burning down Jewish villages and habitations without the rest of the world knowing. But as you can see from this clipping up here in the right-hand corner, it says, the report persistently comes from Berlin that congenital feeble-mindedness, insanity, epilepsy, and some other serious conditions that are inheritable are to be stamped out among the German people. Adolf Hitler is having broad and scientific plans formed for this. If carried out effectively, it will make him the leader of the greatest national movement for human betterment the world has ever seen. The world's two greatest needs are cooperation and industry for social gain, and biological race betterment through eugenics. So, the head of the Minnesota Eugenics Society here, C.F. Dite, finishes out this telegram, and he says, I trust you will accept my sincere wish that your efforts along that line will be a great success and will advance the eugenics movement in other nations as well as in Germany. So we can see to what degree the negative eugenics can be a burden. But again, that's not how, eugenics started out. This science of judicious mating began as a positive thing, to make society better by basically controlling the line of human evolution, by encouraging the positive, by encouraging the eugenically pleasing people to mate, essentially. We know that the practice of eugenics is pretty historically significant, as we can see here. We're closing out with Hitler. So obviously it had a big impact, but what's also significant is the impact it had here in the United States in the form of immigration laws and sterilization laws across the U.S. In the UK, it didn't have as much of a hold, basically, on public policy. It had none, actually, but there were a number of people who wished, that it did. They were afraid in Britain that the best people were immigrating to the United States, and here in the United States, the men in power were afraid that our society was very slowly but surely, being handed over to the feeble-minded, so we needed to sterilize them. We talk in biology nowadays about genetics and genetic mapping and certain things for infants and for children and for parents, and deciding, which children should be carried to term and which shouldn't. So we talk about this, some people talk about this idea of eugenics through the back door, basically, of of genetically modifying children. Should our children have blue eyes and blonde hair? Can we even pick those markers? Some researchers are working towards that. And there are a lot of people who say, that we shouldn't do that, because then it starts this whole sort of eugenics thing all over again, only having, what some people deem as fit people in society. So those are things to think about this weekend. I hope that you will recall some of this stuff for next Tuesday, because we are going to continue talking about it. If you have any questions whatsoever, please write them down so that we can talk about them in class when we come back. And hopefully we can have a pretty good conversation about eugenics. At the very least, begin to sort of think about certain things in historical society, but also in our society today, in terms of eugenics, in the context of who's fit and who's not, and who should procreate and who shouldn't, and things like that. So if you have any questions, again, we will talk about this on Tuesday.